30. Signed. Committee Room 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 30, 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 Committee Room 30. Signed. 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 Committee Room 30. Committee Room 30, signed. 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 Committee Room 30. Sound. 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 Committee Room 30. Sound.
Okay, so if you're content, we're going to proceed. So we've received no apologies, as say Claire.
Just one member delayed. Yes.
Just one member delayed, so hopefully she won't be here much longer. And as I say, hopefully next week then we'll have Padraig as well, so we'll have our full complement of membership. So I have no chair's business this week, and I want to move on to the draft minutes. So the draft minutes are held in your meeting pack at pages 6 to 12. And if you're content with the minutes as a true reflection of the proceedings of the meetings, I'm going to sign them. Does anybody have anything they'd like to raise?
Agreed.
Agreed. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you.
We've actually taken the decision to defer the photo until next week. I know it's just because Padraig Delarge is going to be joining as well, so we thought might as well wait a week. Is that okay? Sorry, we probably would have taken it, but then we have more time to think about things. Okay, so in terms of matters arising, so the allocation of resources that were announced by the Minister of Finance on Monday, there were two items that were not included in the first day brief that we received last week. And they were £96,000 has been allocated for the Strategic Migration Partnership for British nationals overseas, and £102,000 for strategic partnerships for asylum. So with your agreement, I will write to the department to ask for details of these partnerships. Okay, agreed. So I think we'll move on to our oral briefing now, and if we could have our first speaker brought into the room, please. Thank you. Members, just while Jayne's joining us, I just want to refer you to page 15 of the clerk's brief, page 17 for the departmental first day brief, and page 48 for the letter from the Executive Office, which details the responsibilities of the head of the Northern Ireland Civil Service and the TEO Permanent Secretary. So we'll just give it a minute to our guests take their seat. So I'm going to welcome to the meeting Jayne Brady, who is head of the Civil Service. Welcome back Gareth Johnson, who was here last week, who's the acting officer and deputy director with responsibility for good relations and inclusion, in the Executive Office, and Chris Stewart, Deputy Director, Executive Support in the Executive Office. So you're very welcome, everyone, and just when you're ready, if you want to provide us with an oral briefing.
Yes, thank you so much, Chair and Deputy Chair, and congratulations to all members on your appointment. I'm really delighted to be here today. I have with me two colleagues who will be known to you, Gareth Johnson, the Deputy Accounting Officer and Director of Good Relations and Inclusion, and I know you met Gareth last week, and also Chris Stewart, who's the Director of the Executive Support. And I know that Gareth and Chris won't mind me saying that they are two of our most experienced senior executives. I think they've both been in TEO or its predecessors since 2000, so they've kept me on the straight and narrow these past number of years. Chair, as you know, I have two roles, Head of the Civil Service and Secretary to the Executive and Principal Policy Advisor to the First and the Deputy First Minister. And both are a privilege, and I'm delighted that the return of the Executive brings me the opportunity to serve both in all those capacities. I'd like to say a little about my priorities for each role, but let me begin with some general remarks in the context under three themes, and those are strategic challenges, acute pressures and sustainability. Firstly, the returning Executive faces strategic challenges that are similar to those in other jurisdictions, but some of which are unique in degree or have unique dimensions. Examples include health inequalities, climate change, and our low economic productivity. Second, as MLAs will only be too well aware, our citizens and our staff are reeling from a cost of living crisis, and many of our public services are stretched to the point where they cannot safely meet the needs and legitimate expectations of our fellow citizens. Thirdly, as we emerge from a period of no Executive, we have a 2-year backlog of strategic decisions and an urgent need to restart the transformation of public services that is necessary for effective outcomes and for sustainability. That need for sustainable services is matched by a need for sustainable public finances within Northern Ireland, uniquely, presently funded below the objectively measured level of need. So against that challenging backdrop, let me outline my personal priorities and my vision for the civil service that will support the Executive in meeting those challenges and delivering for all our citizens. As Secretary to the Executive, my principal role is to provide strategic advice and then to translate the Executive's political leadership into action. Chair, the one and the only benefit of the 2-year period without an Executive was that I and colleagues had a uniquely long opportunity to work with the political parties to prepare for its return. We took this role very seriously, providing the best advice we had to the parties entitled to form an Executive to ensure that when the Executive was restored, they were as informed as possible. So whilst the challenges are profound, I believe that the new Executive is well informed and prepared for the task in hand as it can be. Our advice took 3 themes: analysis of the long-term structural issues to inform a programme for government, alongside an analysis of common themes in party manifestos. Secondly, detailed financial briefings and current position of finances, the implications of the budget cuts, incoming emergent pressures, for example, public sector pay. And thirdly, a structured approach to sustainable devolution, addressing the immediate need of stabilisation of services, transformation of service delivery, and addressing those long-term key policy areas. Chair, parties engaged very proactively with myself and colleagues in working to understand these issues and provide options to them for an incoming Executive. Not surprisingly then, the Executive is hitting the ground running and is already setting a clear direction as it works out priorities and objectives for the remainder of the mandate. The budget for this year and next and the programme for government are works in progress. However, ministers have already made clear their priorities of stabilising our public services, arresting the decline and working towards recovery, transforming those services to make them sustainable to deliver better outcomes, and resetting our public finances. They have already made clear that addressing public sector pay, including the 23,000 civil servants that I lead, is an immediate priority that is very welcome news indeed. As the Executive firms up its plans and priorities, my role as Head of the Service is to ensure that we are equipped for delivery of that mandate. That will involve some significant changes to the service, not because it is deficient, but because the service needs to adapt to match the new challenges and the priorities for an incoming Executive that it faces. For example, the Executive has recognised that many of the challenges that it faces, such as climate change and indeed our early years in childcare, can't be solved by one department acting alone. Instead, we need a whole system approach. That means increasingly the traditional civil service roles of advice, policy development, strategy delivery need to be done on a cross-departmental basis, providing greater agility against organisational boundaries more than we have in the past. My personal priority is to bolster our capacity for specialised strategic advice. In that regard, I look forward to appointing Northern Ireland's first Chief Scientific and Technology Advisor in the very near future to put science and technology at the heart of our work. Some of you will know that I am an engineer by profession, so you may not be surprised. I'm also investing in analytical capability through our strategic marketing communications capability and through our economic policy unit, which will be rebranded as the Executive Insight and Strategy Unit. We will also look, under the direction of the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, at how we can transform the pace of delivery to support, empower, challenge and provide a relentless focus on the delivery of the Executive's top priorities. They're at an early stage and we would be happy to return to the committee, subject to the advice of the First and Deputy First Minister in the future, as ultimately that will be for Ministers to decide. Since I appeared before the committee, I've also reconstructed and reconstituted the Northern Ireland Civil Service Board with new terms of reference focusing on collective advice and supplementing the membership with 3 high-calibre non-executive members. These members bring a wealth of experience in the public, private, commercial and academic fields and are already adding real value to our service and advice for the executive, as well as bringing a constructive challenge to our work. Looking ahead, my priority and that of the Civil Service Board is the development of a new people strategy with the aim of building the capacity and capability of the service in new and exciting ways. Let me finish by reflecting that in my 2 years in post, I have had the privilege of seeing at first hand the work of the civil service, everywhere from ministerial private offices to prisons and the frontline response teams in our roads and our river services. I am proud to lead that service, in which the quality of our people is outstanding and the ethos of public service is strong. Going forward, my goals are to ensure that we are a service that delivers the Executive's ambitions and an employer that provides high-quality jobs and careers that match the quality of our people. Thank you, and I'll be happy to expand on any of those points or to take any further questions.
Are any of your colleagues speaking at this time?
No, not at this time.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jane, and I really appreciate the update you sent. I suppose some of mine are maybe drilling down a little bit, some of my questions, and just wanted to sort of give you an indication of my priorities in this chair. And around 2016-17, long before your time, Jane, I met with TEO officials who told me at that time that they were drawing up the terms of reference for the historical clerical child abuse research. In the first day brief, that's still an outstanding action, so I'm just wondering what's been the hold up on that and where we are going with that. I also am conscious that there has been talk for many years now around the institutions contributing to the redress scheme for the historical institutional abuse victims and survivors, and again that's something that's long standing, and I'm sort of picking up on some of your words there, Jane, around greater agility and pace of delivery, and I suppose the last point in this space is around the redress scheme for the mothers and adoptees of the mother and baby homes. As you know, when we were approaching the end of the historical institutional abuse inquiry, the victims and survivors were saying, we know that Sir Anthony Hart is going to recommend a redress scheme. Can you not get on and start developing the framework for that? And then we had the delay, then the collapse of the Assembly, and then it's been many years. So I wouldn't like to think that the mother and baby homes are going to have to go through the whole inquiry as well. So I'd like a little bit of comfort that that redress scheme is closer in time. So I'll leave it with those sort of 3 linked, and then I'll come back in. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. For those specific aspects, I will ask my colleague Gareth to pick up in terms of the address and debate. I know there are many elements that we have been progressing in the absence of an executive, but of course, rightly, there's decisions that have been led for impact within that group. So maybe, Gareth, you can pick up on both those areas.
Surely. On the historical clerical child abuse, of course, there was an interdepartmental working group that was set up to consider and to make recommendations on mother and baby homes, Magdalen laundries, and historical clerical child abuse. It had prioritised the first 2 of those, and I'll come back to where we stand there. But as you know, that led to the appointment of the Truth Recovery Design Panel, their report, and now to the implementation of that report. On historical clerical child abuse, and here we mean abuse that took place outside the kind of residential settings that the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry would have been looking at. We did make, during the absence of the executive, well, in fact, just before the absence of the executive, we did make a very concerted attempt to get that research underway. It made some progress, particularly in regard to how we access the records that churches and religious institutions hold. But it turned out just to be too big of a project for the research team that had been appointed. So we have a new...
Right, just before you go
Yes,
on,
yeah.
but that was always going to be the case. That was always going to be the case, and I think the terms of reference had to be defined in such a way that it wasn't going to be so big that it became overwhelming, was my understanding 7 or 8 years ago.
We had tried to draft them in a way that made it doable, but I think it's only when you get into the phase where you have people in and looking at this and starting to look at exactly how much work is going to be involved, and the research team felt that they had to stand down after say having done some work which has been banked, and that's been good. We have a new chair of the interdepartmental working group who has come in, and working with her, we are we've split the research project into 3 parts. One of those parts has been out to tender, and we are looking to get the other 2 out and underway really as soon as possible. We've been continuing to have meetings with the Victims Reference Group, the Victims and Survivors Reference Group, and the new chair has been meeting them as well. So I recognise, and I have apologised to the victims of the group, that it has taken a lot longer than anyone would have wanted. There was an attempt. It didn't work out, but we are now seeing substantive movement, I believe, in what's a very important area. On the HIA redress scheme and the contributions from institutions, Paul Sweeney was appointed to lead those initial discussions with the institutions. Paul has made a lot of progress in terms of setting out a framework for the contributions. And we now have 2 institutions who are ready to make payments, or almost ready to make payments. And another couple that we're in discussions with who I think won't be too much further behind. So just once we've rounded off some discussions with them, I would envisage putting recommendations to ministers about that first set of contributions, with the view that we would receive those fairly early in the new financial year. There's then a couple of other institutions, and the discussions there are still continuing.
Okay, so it hasn't. It is progressing.
But early in the new financial year, I think you'll see some money starting to flow. On the mother and baby homes and the redress scheme, and it's important for 2 reasons that scheme is enshrined in legislation. First of all, so that the body responsible for administering it would have statutory powers to demand information. And secondly, just so that the permissions are there, the financial permissions are there for expenditure of what will be, and rightly will be, a substantial sum of money. The work has been progressing on the project. Since it was launched, we have had something like 30 meetings of the consultation forum with victims. We're now delivering services through Victims and Survivors Service, comprehensive package of services to some 250 victims and survivors. The independent panel, the 10-person independent panel, was appointed in April 2023, and that's going to be starting to take people's experiences, starting to record people's experiences and to acknowledge them. The legislation, we are just finalising some material for ministers to consider on the policy direction that's needed before we go out to consultation. As soon as we've done that, we'd envisage being out to consultation with the plans and the legislation.
Okay, thank you. So just moving on quickly then. So again in the first day brief there was a talk around looking at the review of TBUC and then maybe phase 2 of urban villages, and as you know there's quite a serious overlap between what Urban Villages does and what the Neighbourhood Renewal Programme of Department for Communities has done and is doing. And in the current financial circumstances, are there any plans to try and move forward with those dovetailed, aligned or possibly even assimilated?
Maybe provide some context, you can provide specifics of the project. I guess we recognise the financial implications of the incoming executive as well as the areas to look towards opportunities for alignment, as you've rightly said, Department of Communities, TBUC, and we took an initiative through the next board to explore some areas where we can see those alignments in terms of looking at pilot projects, but also overall at the service level. What obligations are we putting on the areas and sectors that we're trying to support that actually perhaps we can provide some opportunities for minimising that burden, but also looking to more joined up approach. And I think as we come into the new executive, that may be a lesson we look towards more broadly. How can we look towards joining up across the service to implement that? So Department of Communities and the Executive Office brought together a proposal for a programme to trial that, which is now ongoing. Civil Service Board sanctioned and agreed that, and the projects are coming ongoing. So I'll ask Gareth to talk to the actual specifics of that project.
Yeah. So there are now 2 pilot projects that have started, one rural, one urban, which are precisely on this point about recognising that despite best intentions, the interventions of government departments in vulnerable communities can seem quite silo-based, and while they address important issues, they may not always be the most important issues for the local communities. I think we've seen some good models, including in urban villages, of getting alongside local communities, building capacity individually and in groups, and coming to a shared understanding of what needs to be done. And that's exactly what this pilot is about. So I'm personally quite enthused about it. I think it could lead, in fact it's already leading to much more partnership. You heard the other day some of the money that's coming to education, about reducing educational disadvantage. In the Executive Office we're already working in partnership with the Department of Education to see how we can use our networks to help to deliver that. So very keen to see this, and I think every indication that it will lead to much more joined up ways of working.
Okay, thanks. And a very quick one for you, Gareth. So last week at committee you said that you expected the books to balance and to break even at the end of the financial year, and then the very next day then the Finance Minister gave your department 3.4 million to cover overspend. So we just wondered if you could write to us and explain sort of the difference between breaking even and then requiring 3.4 million.
Well, certainly within the Executive Office, we're still expecting to balance. If anything, my pleas with business areas to pull back spending. Well, they've certainly taken it to heart,
okay.
And I'm not expecting that we will have an overspend going into next year.
Okay, appreciate that. Any further update would be appreciated. Connie, please.
Yep.
Deputy Chair.
Thank you. Thanks for both coming. Thank you all for coming today and presenting to the committee. A few questions. 2 are around commissioners. Jane, thank you very much, and I'm excited to hear about the role of the Chief Scientific and Technology Advisor. I was wondering if you could just maybe expand on that. First of all, could you just, sorry if I picked it up wrong, could you confirm, do you appoint that role or does the First and Deputy First Minister? And just a bit more information on their remit. Another issue was on the first day in your presentation there, you'd mentioned climate was obviously a priority for the executive. and my understanding from the Climate Change Act was there was to be an appointment of a Climate Commissioner. Is that something that the First and Deputy First Minister will appoint, and do you have an update on that as well?
Okay, no, very happy to. The Chief Scientific and Technology Advisor, in Northern Ireland we have an unusual situation that at the executive level we do not have a Chief Scientific Advisor, which is the only area in these islands actually that doesn't have it at that level. There is, of course, a Chief Scientific Advisor in health and in agriculture. So as I came into the executive, that was an area that I identified as a gap, that actually there were tables around which we're not sitting, and indeed providing that collective advice into the executive. Through the engagement we have, there's an interim Chief Scientific Advisor in position, but we had, and in fact, prior to the collapse of the last executive, I had a submission which was approved in terms of progressing the appointment of that, the Chief Scientific and Technology Advisor, which is underway. That would be an appointment that I would make, and it's of a temporary perspective. It's for a 3-year term, and it's on a part-time basis. They would provide advice into the executive office to the next board, but also would be able to advise independent advice to specific ministers as well. And I think that's a critical aspect, I guess, to complement kind of some of our key challenges that parties have identified for the programme for government, delivering, and we're going to come up in the Climate Commissioner, delivering on our climate obligations, but also our opportunities is something that's going to be addressed across the executive. So taking, a specific focus just from the Department of Agriculture and Environment, where we have a scientific advisor, needs to have a broader perspective, so advising in terms of that cross-cutting programme for government as well. So we expect that to be appointed within the next number of weeks. I know this was an issue that was raised during the COVID inquiry, the absence of that key role and key strategic perspective. So I think they will have a very significant complement to the level and quality of advice that we can provide in that cross-cutting aspect, as well as supporting individual departments. You're right, of course, that the Climate Commission role is an area that we will be appointing, and we've actually appointed through this period a lead in terms of setting up that Climate Commission office, and I'll ask Gareth just to discuss where we are, and of course we've for the public appointments as well, those key roles.
We have established a small division that's looking after the TEO's role in respect of climate change, part of which is the appointment of the Climate Change Commissioner and the creation of that office, and part of which is just helping us across TEO to see our responsibilities in all our programmes for green growth. That, just to answer the question, that is an appointment for the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, and I understand that colleagues will be putting up advice on the arrangements for that appointment in the near future.
Thank you. If I have time, Chair,
Yes,
can I one more? Yeah. It's just last thing for me then is obviously your department is responsible for the Period Products Free Provision Act. Can I just ask when we'd expect regulations coming forward for full implementation of that act?
The regulations, each department was to make regulations. Those were by affirmative resolution, and so that couldn't be done in the absence of ministers. But now that ministers are back, now the executive rather is back, I understand that all departments who haven't already put forward their regulations are doing that, and certainly we'll be doing that from the executive office, and I'm not aware of any particular difficulties there. Those regulations are to specify the public bodies who have a duty to provide period products. The executive office then has the overarching, the purpose of that power is more around the needs of people who might happen to be in the building at the time. In terms of the wider provision to members of the public, that's the responsibility of the executive office, and the statutory duty kicks in May, and we are geared up to be able to start to deliver that from May. We have been partnering initially with libraries and looking towards the free provision through libraries, but then looking to expand that through councils. And in fact, I was talking to chief executives of councils yesterday and referenced this, that we want to bring those conversations to a conclusion so that we can see council premises, which of course are often open in evenings and weekends and the like, to make sure that there's availability there too. So it'll be a staged process, but ready to start delivery from May.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I have Sinead, Harry, Carol and then Claire.
Okay. Thank you, Jane, and it's great to see you at the committee once again. In relation to the programme for government and I suppose the need to transform outcomes across a range of policy frameworks, and I welcome your response in terms of cross-cutting response and whole system approach to government. I specifically want to talk, you'll not be surprised, about regional balance and how there is a need for that cross-cutting approach from all departments. Like, one department can't deliver regional balance because it takes the whole heave-ho of everybody to actually do that. And I suppose the need, when we talk about outcomes as well, it's the need to look at where government, the whole of government, needs to intervene when we see disadvantage. So I just, as the leader of the civil service, I would like to know, your approach to regional balance and how you can see that being delivered in a whole systems approach, and what methodology and measures that you would put into place to make sure that there is delivery and there is outcomes and the changes that we need to be met in our communities is met. So just regional balance.
Great to see you again in this context, Sinead. And of course, decisions in terms of policy for regional balance is for ministers to decide. My job in the civil service is to provide the richest level of information and data to allow them to inform those decision making. So in looking at the programme for government, because it is such a priority, I will take SRO personally for that. So obviously I have a role within the executive office, my colleagues here deliver in the executive office, but I have a role across the service, and there are some areas that I shared across departmental, understanding that they have a priority, and they need that joined up service that we have across those. Francis, Women and Girls is, I think, a really good example of how we've done, although unfortunately in the absence of an executive, that co-design and worked on the ground and putting the citizen and the person, real person at the start of it. You talked about the programme for government, and obviously there was the outcomes framework which were consulted on, but not agreed in the previous executive, and they looked towards those overall kind of core outcomes that we want for that North Star, that place that we want all our children and citizens to live in. I guess below that then there's the indicators to know how are we in terms of getting towards there, but also then there's the policies. What is the stuff that we have to do to help us to get on that journey? And that for me is the programme for government. What are the core aspects? You'll know that the parties entitled to form an executive have identified a small number of key objectives in terms of that first priorities, of which childcare and obviously the stabilisation of our services is one. But in addition to that advice, and that will be for ministers and executive to decide, we've looked towards where that programme for government, those outcomes frameworks have lied, and where that can be used in terms of the overall context. Also looking at the OECD, their indicators for sustainable development goals, looking at best practice elsewhere, but also then basing that on dashboards and information that embeds that citizen-centred perspective, and that includes that geographical-centred perspective. So underneath those outcomes and frameworks, which again, that policy will be for ministers to decide, we have created an integrated database from dashboards that takes the NISRA information, which allows you to have actually the information for those key areas of where that is from a council area perspective, so we can provide that data informed, and indeed that citizens or MLAs can look to have a view for that. Now those are just options that we're putting forward for the FM and DFM for their decision first of all, and indeed the ministers, but making sure that they're as informed, as rich as possible. And part of my view in that kind of looking towards that core best advice is using data and evidence to inform those areas, because actually that will be to know whether we are in the outcome to deliver those North Star frameworks as well.
Right, and that's really good to hear that, because I mean we do have a lot of data and evidence in and around a lot of these indices, you know, economic activity and productivity and all of that there, and we need to feed that data in so that we can get the outcomes out. I specifically want to ask about leadership around the Northwest City region and the regional balance in and around that, and the considerations already taking place within the programme for government. Do you see that that is rising up as a priority for intervention?
I guess that would, again, as you'd appreciate, be a decision for ministers to take in terms of policy decision. I think it's clear to see, as we have the information that we provided to an incoming executive, is that there is a disparity between certain sections of our community, people with disabilities, between women, the regional balance element. Those are core aspects and areas that there is a level of disparity across this region. So that will, I guess, look towards what the policy priorities are, but actually how do we address the areas that we haven't fulfilled that. But again, obviously you'll appreciate that's not for me to, the advice I would give to those ministers would be for them to make that ultimate decision.
Just one small bit as well. Obviously there's a role with TEO in relation to the Northwest Growth Strategic Partnership, and the Northwest City region covers 2 jurisdictions, and it's really important to see leadership within the executive office in and around that. How do you see that developing and being funded into the future within this programme for government? What considerations has that been given?
Maybe ask some of my colleagues who may come in more specifics in terms of Northwest. Obviously we have investments in Edmonton and the developments in there, particularly in the entrepreneurship aspect. It was my pleasure when we had some of our investors over here in these islands, some of the most substantive investors we've had in these islands, to showcase actually all of Northern Ireland. So Belfast does get quite a little bit of the limelight, and for good reasons, but actually showing that in the Northwest and in Mid-Ulster, those kind of engineering titans as well. So that's a kind of key aspect of actually we've shown a more holistic offer. But maybe I'll ask Gareth to comment on some of those investments and that partnership in the Northwest.
And certainly for TEO as a department, in terms of our programmes, the working regionally continues to be a priority. Those couple of pilot programmes that I mentioned between departments, neither of them is in Belfast, and through urban villages and just looking at the next phase of urban villages, we've been in Belfast, we've been in Derry in the Northwest, and I think there is potential to look even more widely regionally as we share that model and take the advantages that urban villages has brought in terms of working in a reasonably short, sharp way with a particular community. Of course, the likes of the victims programme and the likes of the good relations programmes where we fund all district councils, we've been careful to make sure that we're taking account of the needs of people right across the region.
I'd also say that the Chief Scientific and Technology Advisor would be an asset that would be availed to all the council areas. I was Digital Innovation Commissioner in the Belfast Region City Deal, which covered 6 council areas, and it was key to me that level of specialist capability is really important for the whole of Northern Ireland. So that, in terms of, obviously there's the Derry Strabane deal itself and providing that critical leadership, but also providing a voice for all those regions at various different tables, and a joined up approach as well, which I think will be of benefit to all the city and growth deals.
Thank you. Harry, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Ms. Brady, and your top team. Early on, you mentioned health inequalities. I'm just wondering, what do you see being done to address this, and then to follow on from that, how big an issue is it? Thank you.
Thank you. So in the advice that we provided to the parties entitled to firm executive, we looked towards the data sets, that kind of the critical structural issues that may look to inform an incoming executive in terms of their priorities. And undoubtedly, kind of as evidence, sadly, your socio-economic background would dictate some of your health outcomes. Very largely, it's the biggest component in terms of looking towards your life expectancies. I notice that we have Mr Kingston here, who's from the same area of North Belfast as myself, which has some of the lowest life expectancies from from males, which hasn't changed over the last 25 years. So looking towards that advice in those areas, what are the indicators that actually impact those life opportunities and indeed age expectancies? And we know that many of those can't be addressed in the Department of Health, would be my advice to an incoming executive, that actually some of those are predestined to the more early years intervention, and indeed in providing pathways to more and better jobs, and addressing kind of the structural inadequacies. So that, I guess, is advice in terms of unpacking life expectancies. What are the indicators? But that is ultimately for an incoming executive to decide what their priorities are. I know that they've identified childcare in early years as a particular area of intervention, and again, that's a generational type piece. We can't solve life expectancies in a 3 or indeed a 5-year mandate, but it requires long-standing focus. And I guess we look towards our economic perspective and our areas where we are 20% below the UK average in terms of productivity and 40% below the south of Ireland. Those are much. Yet we have a skills crisis. So how we bridge the pathways for those who haven't got those good jobs available to them, those will also ultimately identify the health outcomes. I think it's well understood, but actually towards Ms McLaughlin's point regarding unpacking the data and evidence to inform what are the specific areas that we need to address and what are the key things that we need to focus on would be my advice into an executive, but ultimately for ministers to decide in that programme for government.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. Yep.
Carol, please.
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions. First of all, I'd like some more detail, but just a brief overview, Gareth, just in terms of this pilot scheme. Where is it? I want to ask for an update on the amendments to the veto for employment and treatment order, and just to go back to an outcomes-based approach to a programme for government. So just in terms of where is the pilot scheme, where you're talking about amalgamating neighbourhood renewal and other projects. So we want to start with that.
Yeah. The two pilots, one is in Derry and one is in Donaghcloney, and the thinking there was to have both urban and rural, but that's not the beginning and end of the pilot work on this.
So that's fine. I just want to ask
in terms of those two. Yes.
So the only point I'll make is I get really worried when I hear people talking about amalgamating funds in neighbourhood renewal areas, because they are the most deprived. Okay, and at times I think neighbourhood renewal should be anti-poverty. It has to be with an outcome. Okay, unless you get that investment, because there's always, talk about silos within community and voluntary sector. I have to be honest, I see more silos in central government than in communities, and I find it's a bit offensive at times. I'm not saying you're doing it deliberately, but
May I come in on that?
But just let me finish my point. Communities, because they've had very little, have had to work together even when they didn't want to. And communities like Bran and mine, and probably parts of Sinead's, where their interfaces are invaluable, and a lot of those projects are funded through neighbourhood renewal, and they shouldn't be, right? So I just wanted to make that point, because I just feel that the community sector is often referred to but often overlooked when it comes to investment, and particularly investment in areas that have systemic inequalities and haven't had the funding that they deserve or are entitled to. So unless you put that funding in, you're not going to have better life expectancy in North Belfast. That's the point I would make. So
back briefly.
Yeah.
I think the reference to silos, and apologies if it was confused, was actually silos within central government.
Yeah.
That actually we've got many. I met the neighbourhood renewal committees, remember, and they do phenomenal work. And I've been up in particularly ones around from North Belfast and and the things that they're doing, and actually the joined up interventions, to address, with providing childcare provision on top of food banks and a service to actually allow people in a very structured way to get reskilled, but the wraparound things that need to be provision. I guess what I heard when I met with those kind of neighbourhood unions, and I met with them a number of times, is, and we've got the people and place strategy, which is for consideration for coming forward, is that it was difficult to deal with us. That actually there was lots of forums. There was like a folder this for size for one department, and there was this for another, and actually you were applying in different ways for different things, and it was complicated.
It's not just that. With respect, it's also about people coming to the table. So, and I think it's too easy to say it's about bureaucracy and form filling. It's not. It's an ethos. It's also about working class people. It's also about, by and large, civil servants coming out to the communities and being equal partners around the table, and that hasn't happened. So I'm just saying to you,
And I really appreciate your candor.
the 36 neighbourhood renewal partnerships, in my opinion, need an interdepartmental, central and local government, community and voluntary sector approach. It's only when that mutual respect it happens, then you'll feel a better outcome around the table, but you'll actually get better. Because to be fair to everybody wants to have better outcomes. It's just that there's a lethargy, for want of a better term, about getting there. So I'll just park that one. The FEDO order, there's amendments to the Fair Employment and Treatment Order, 1998 legislation, in respect to people who still face barriers as a result of the political conflict here. What is the update on that, if there is any?
Yes, in terms of people with conflict-related provisions, I confess I'll have to go and check that. I'd come prepared on teachers, but I'll check just the latest position on that and come back to you.
I chaired that group yesterday, actually, so I met with representatives of that group. And we went through, I guess, those key areas that there were still barriers, and we had an action plan. I know that there is a submission to be put to ministers regarding bringing that forward, and we look towards actually reflecting 25 years in how that next needs to move. So it was very constructive engagement with that sector yesterday. And
I've no doubt we'll get an update. And the final thing is, in relation to the programme for government, there's never been a standalone outcome around housing, and it was put in the infrastructure category. See, particularly given the figures of people who are living in housing stress and housing need. There's housing need everywhere, but people who have got housing stress is constantly going up, and the supply isn't matching it, and it's very difficult. The other thing is, local development plans coming now in local government, particularly in rural communities. How can that happen? Because people who grew up in towns and villages and cities cannot either afford or get somewhere to live. They're in the private rented sector. They're very vulnerable. I mentioned it last week in terms of mayors. I know tenants who've been there for 20 years getting eviction notices, and mayors have taken over the contract, and they're giving the landlord a lot more money. So it's market approach, and it's absolutely nothing to do with the vulnerable people who mayors are supposed to be looking at. It's not their fault. I think it's ours. It's British government's fault. And I would like to see as a standalone housing, because if you have somewhere to live, you're all sorts of health categories, and mental health categories, and economic potential will certainly be addressed. I'm just saying 3 and 4 generations in our constituency living in homelessness, and I just feel despondent. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah. So on the outcome, and I noted that you'd raised it in the Assembly in terms of the outcome for housing as part of that. And again, that's a part of the consideration of the index we're looking at. We had, and obviously you referenced the mayors as the Home Office policy, and I had significant engagement and correspondence over the last period, particularly in terms of the kind of ongoing pressures that's put in terms of the services within the Home Office. Indeed, dealt very closely with the housing executive and the particular pressures that's involved. So maybe, Gareth, you want to give an update, I guess, on where I know there's been over the last number of months we've had particular pressures on the housing perspective, which has kind of been exasperated by Home Office actions?
Now, housing executive colleagues, I have to say, have been working above and beyond on this.
They have. Just put that on the record.
And what they've experienced over the last few months, though, has been, I think the Home Office has been trying to clear the books, as it were, ready for the implementation of the Illegal Migration Act. And that has meant between last summer and November, there was a 9.5-fold increase in the number of people who were being granted asylum. Now, that's great.
That was reflected in the
they're coming to the end of their application, and that's very significant for each individual who's impacted. But of course, it meant that a whole lot of people needed to be found housing solutions in a quick time scale. I know, and Jane and I had raised this with the Permanent Secretary at the Home Office, and I know colleagues in DFC has written as well to see could there be any capital money that might come. We actually, Housing Executive has identified a number of properties that could be brought back into use, but it would depend on getting some capital funding, and I know Home Office has been putting capital funding, for example, into former army barracks in other places, so we have been raising that again with the Home Office. But of course all of this in the context, and I wouldn't want it to be misunderstood, because there have been some very difficult situations and very bad and evil things done in some communities recently, and threats given. At the end of the day, those who have been granted asylum are entitled to the same as everybody else, but also face the same difficulties as everybody else. And we know that there are acknowledged difficulties in the supply of housing for everybody who needs it, and not just for
That's
refugees.
why we wanted the programme for government, Carl.
Okay, thank you. And we did raise last week that this is an issue of particular interest to this committee. So, thank you. So I'm going to go on to Claire. Claire, please.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Jane, and everyone else. For me, the biggest thing that this executive do, whether they have time to do it, is transformation. And I'm conscious that we have lost 2 years of this mandate. I'm conscious that there's been a lot of issues because of that, not just the last 2 years, probably the last 10 years. So how do you work through that parallel process of emptying the sink but also turning off the tap? Because these issues will continue to go ahead, and I know it's often a popular thing to just to invest an awful lot of money into clearing waiting lists, and that's that's perfectly fine. But then how do we transform it so that those waiting lists don't pile up again at the top end? So I suppose really, how are you going to be advising the executive to look towards a more upstream approach, maybe a more invest to save approach, so that we can actually genuinely get that transformation? Certainly where we are, post Good Friday Agreement has probably been transitional up until now, but really if we want to move things on, we do have to transform. But that happens with taking a strategic approach and outlook towards how we deliver public services. And I suppose that would even give me, a criticism in terms of the outcomes-based accountability approach. Do you think even the structures of our government, lend itself to that type of approach? Should we be maybe looking towards other jurisdictions where they would maybe have a department for children, so that those outcomes are actually within departments? Like, realistically, can departments work together in that way that we would want them to, if they're having to, keep to their own bottom line, if they're having to keep to their own very specific, measurable priorities? I don't think that's going to be a conversation for this mandate, but certainly is it something we look toward. A few other things I'll maybe just give you all at once, Chair, if you're happy enough. Tackling paramilitarism. I was personally quite invested in that particular programme. I always felt it was going to fail whenever the government collapsed, because without a programme for government which actually supported those outcomes, we need to build communities up. We need to give them aspirations so that they're not going to be exploited by paramilitaries. So do you feel that that's something that is going to be part of this executive? Because it ultimately does come down to social economic issues and people who are exploiting them, and that happens in every community and jurisdiction probably across UK and Ireland. But how do we genuinely do that and be mindful of that within a programme for government? I agree with Carl in terms of the housing, 100%. It's a huge issue in my own constituency. We probably are coming at it from a different perspective, and that a lot of our housing opportunities are being displaced by second homeowners.
Yeah.
And it's not criticisms of those second homeowners, it's the lack of housing stock that just doesn't exist for people who are coming from a social deprivation kind of background. Where I would maybe put a call in as well is for older people. We only have to look at the census results and the demographics and the changing demographics. And certainly if we're looking, as I said at the outset, of a strategic transformational approach, we have to recognise as people get older, there are going to be more demands on our health services, there are going to be demands on our social care and all of that. So that's going to be impacting. And if we don't almost forward plan for that now, we're going to find ourselves in the situation that we have with GPs, we're going to find ourselves in the situation that we have with waiting lists, which then leads on to other issues as well. So are you taking that kind of mindful approach and almost future-proofing? Because I do think a lot of the problems that we're finding ourselves in, and because that work didn't happen 10 years ago. So a lot there.
How much then? No, thank you very much for those questions. And to your first point in terms of transformation, so the incoming ministers, we've had 2 executive meetings now, they have, I guess, input we provided, but actually from their thoughts that they have, I guess there's 3 different aspects to this, and the advice I would give is we're in a period where we need to stabilise, and so that's getting the fundamentals right, and there has been kind of structural issues caused by the budget implications and the fundamentals like public sector pay, and that's stabilisation. But actually, if you don't transform while stabilisation, you'll just be continually collapsing, and I don't mean executive collapsing, but your services will be collapsing, because actually fiscally, no matter how much funding we get, our services are unacceptable from a delivery perspective, because we are an outlier for many of those, again, particularly in the areas of health and waiting lists and special education needs to any of these regions. But also fiscally they're unsustainable, and they will involve the entirety of the budget, as well as being unacceptable for our citizens. So in the structure that I have been advising and direction being given by those ministers, there's an element to stabilise, but you also need to transform. But in transforming the services, we can't say we have to transform everything, because we have to be realistic in what is achievable. And I know obviously in the stabilisation there's some elements of waiting lists, but waiting lists, whilst really important to get to an acceptable level, actually the issue, as you rightly point out, is getting upstream of that. So how do you get upstream of waiting lists? And that's multidisciplinary teams, and it's healthcare, social care settings to keep people at home, to stop people getting into that area. But also further upstream for that is actually the long-term 10, 20-year structural things, is actually putting more money in people's pockets, intervening earlier so they do not kind of end up in those demographics where your life expectancy is predicted by where you live or what your economic boundary is. So my advice has been there needs to be 3 elements. To restructure, we need to stabilise, we need to transform service delivery, but also we need to look at those key structural areas to actually provide the resilience, because as I've noted, I think there's been 3 structural shocks to Northern Ireland in the just over 2 years that I've been in position, and actually we're more vulnerable to those because we've got the lowest disposable income, we're the highest kind of levels of fuel poverty, we have the highest levels of femicide, some of the highest levels of death by suicide in these islands, and engagement of people. So those are the things that we need to address, but actually we need to be focused in terms of a few priorities and how we can do that. And the executive, as I've said, they have acknowledged in terms of that initial addressing the stabilisation, but to identify a number of priorities that we can focus on over the long term. And I guess you mentioned then coming out to those areas to focus on over the long term. Many of those are so complex that you can't solve health and health, you can't solve economy and economy. Those things you can't solve. The opportunities for green growth in the policy lead departments. So that needs to be a cross-structural area, and it needs to be a focus. So I've been asked to look to see what could be advice in terms of looking at structures to do that, but also what's the best advice in terms of doing that. And there are different models being done elsewhere in different regions, and we're looking at those delivery units, best advice, but not to disempower any other departments, but actually to enable those areas. And you talked about other programmes that we've delivered. So I chair the Tackling Paramilitarism programme, and I chair the Violence Against Women and Girls programme. And indeed, neither of those can be achieved in Justice, for example, which is the lead department, or Violence Against Women and Girls, which is executive. That requires the so multifaceted a whole of Northern Ireland approach, never mind a whole of services. So we're looking at those models to see what is the optimum, but focusing on some of those key priorities, but and ultimately for the executive to advise. The Tackling Paramilitarism programme. So in the last 2 years, we have looked towards broadening that kind of sponsor group, of which I chair, and we have the housing executive represented on that, because it's a key asset and aspect of early intervention, and we have obviously the PSNI and those key areas. Some of the kind of the most inspirational things I've seen have been out to visit those projects. Monkstown Boxing Club, just phenomenal work, intervening at the very kind of early stages, but at the most difficult aspects of those areas, and how we engage. You know, that's education, that's health, and that's obviously the executive office, those specific interventions. We're reflecting on where that programme's got us to, and obviously there's a political advisory group sitting alongside that, but also some of that is potentially to be mainstreamed into. So Violence Against Women and Girls, you know, ultimately should be a lens, in my view, that can be looked through different policy interventions. So it's not just a thing on the side. And I think that tackling paramilitary is how can we actually make sure that we're delivering those from a mainstream perspective as well. And obviously the role of IRC as well will be important. But again, that will be for the political advisory group to give direction on how those things are moved forward.
And just before you go on, I think Chris wanted to come in there.
Just very briefly, Chair, thank you. Yes, I feel I haven't earned my money yet today, so I better make some contribution to the meeting. Just add a little bit on transformation. And one of your earlier questions, which is how do we make it happen? Because it's not that there hasn't been a desire for transformation in the past. It's been a goal and objective of the executive in every mandate that I've served in. I think the key is governance and effective ring fencing of any resources identified for transformation. There will always be immediate pressures on which to spend the money, and a huge amount of political pressure on ministers to do just that. Within health, and at the danger of straying into that department's territory, there will always be opportunities to spend money in secondary care. There's always pressure there, and you know, as Jayne said, we couldn't keep up with the demand. I think if Neil Gibson were here, he would say that in order to keep up with demand, we'd have to double the rates every year just to fund health and education services. So the trick will be governance, and this will be challenging, but arrangements which ring fence and protect the money, direct it away from immediate pressures which need to be dealt with under the stabilisation regime that Jayne talked about, and into transformation, and then even within that, ensuring that we invest as far upstream as possible in the areas where we know we'll secure the greatest benefits and outcomes in the end. And in health, that takes you inevitably towards primary care and care in the community, particularly primary care. Jayne mentioned multidisciplinary teams. That's a very evidence-based one. That's one where we know investment more than pays for itself in terms of better medium and longer term outcomes for citizens.
And I guess, you know, in defining how you make this reality, some of this needs hard levers. It needs more than warm words. It needs different structures, and it needs funding. So I think that will be my advice, is to say, you know, we can say this, you know, we can put anything in a PowerPoint, but actually making that the reality will be where we actually kind of show the evidence base as part of this. So I know with obviously the discussions are ongoing with Department of Finance and Treasury and that, but there is an identification of a ring-fenced element of funding for transformation. I think it's 50 million per year as part of that objective, but that wouldn't touch the sides of any health transformation, obviously. But it creates a vehicle to look towards how you can deliver transformation. I think actually digital transformation, probably as a digital innovation commissioner, you know, there's a really opportunity to actually how we look forward in terms of both our internal infrastructure, but providing services more in a more flexible way. Encompass, which was delivered by the Health Service, the digital patient records was a very significant transformation delivered in a very challenging time. So there's signs of, we are able to do and deliver in those aspects too. You mentioned just older people, and I guess
Just very quickly, because there's still a few more to come back in. Yeah.
So I think there are a number of different demographics. I think what we're identifying with that dashboard and that NISRA analysis is what lens can you look under to inform those areas. And I think from a reskilling perspective, I'm speaking later on to one of my engineering cohorts, but actually I think it's a real opportunity for that older generation from a reskilling perspective into kind of those new engineering-led jobs as well. And there's more of a continuous, so that the all-age apprenticeships, which was delivered, I think was a really important aspect, and not to recognise that you can have a different career and a reskilling opportunity, as well as making sure that we're actually looking towards the demographic age profile from our services, that we're not designing it on a generation ago from those demographics.
Thank you. I'm going to move on. Go ahead, Brian. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Two questions. One to Gareth. I'm going to ask a bit more about the pilot project, just because there was reference made to TBUC and urban villages, and then Carol was talking about neighbourhood renewal, which is DFC, and the first two, I think, are primarily good relations at heart, and the latter is anti-poverty. So can you clarify what the pilot projects, what they are referenced to in terms of what has gone before, and what potentially might follow on from them? What are they piloting?
They're piloting a more joined up approach. So while absolutely there have been the different programmes, neighbourhood renewal with its particular focus, urban villages, good relations, have had a good relations focus, communities in transition, and all of these are important programmes in their own right, and we're not immediately doing anything to upset that. But the pilots really are about, well, could we start to bring some of those priorities and indeed some other priorities like ending violence against women and girls, like reducing educational disadvantage, to bring those together into a common framework that we can work alongside communities with, get boots on the ground, taking Carol's point very much. This isn't about communities being talked down to, it's about getting civil servants alongside the communities to see what the priorities are, and just stepping out of our individual zones. One of the key lessons that's coming forward from the review of good relations, for example, the review of TBUC, is how intertwined that is with economic growth, with mental health, with educational attainment, with so many other areas, that if you could start to address those, you're doing something for good relations too, but you can bring a good relations flavour to the work. You're doing something about strengthening communities against paramilitaries, but you can bring a tackling paramilitarism flavour to the work. So it's really about trying to bring all of that together.
Is it cross-departmental then, or would TEO be taking the lead? Or?
It's cross-departmental. In fact, some of the origins were from the fact that Department for Communities is doing a review of the neighbourhood renewal scheme and wanted to explore some of these issues. As it happens, one of my colleagues is chairing the group, but it's a cross-departmental group.
Okay, we'll hear more obviously in due course, but that's given a bit more information. And second question is just regarding the programme for government, and I know you'll probably throw this back at us and say that it's a political matter, but you referenced earlier about some preparatory work having happened between parties. Paper talks about no published programme for government since 2011, I think it was. So what do you think are the prospects of reaching a published programme for government?
Good question.
And can you say anything? Do you feel work is underway in that, or how far down the road are we? And I know you'll say that's for us, but anyway, what would you say?
So, of course, it just goes without saying, of course, that is for the executive and for FM and DFM in the first instance to provide a pathway to options. I guess it's been in the public domain, but after local elections in May, 2 years ago, we brought. I invited the parties in to kind of form in terms of that briefing for the executive. The first thing I did was analyse. There was the 4 parties intended to form an executive, analyse the party manifestos in the areas of cross-cutting elements, and then parties led into those core streams, and those were a number of different areas we've talked about, that kind of, the productivity, that poor kind of economic outlook, green growth, and then the life opportunities that segments of our community are not achieving, life opportunities, which ties into their overall outcomes. So a large body of work was done, and I know that members maybe around this table were engaged in those areas. There was, I think, 20 plus meetings, hundreds of hours of work with civil servants in terms of forming that, and it gets a data-led information review of that. Subsequently then we looked towards separate briefings in terms of the actual fiscal position that we're in. So obviously as we come, with the implications of the budget, what actually were the fiscal realities. And I guess you can't look at a programme for government, or in my view you shouldn't look at a programme for government outside of the realities of its affordability. It shouldn't be a document that is issued and published and isn't in terms of its affordability. So the reality of that fiscal position, and obviously then how those 3 legs of the stool, how do we sustain, do public sector kind of pay, sustainability of services, transformation of some of those services, and then looking towards those long-term structural elements. So there are different options for a programme for government, and that will be for FM and DFM to reach a conclusion on. In essence, a Section 20 programme requires a programme of things that are kind of the cross-cutting area, priorities. It can be as much or as little as you want. So that can be for a 1 year perspective to deliver Section 20. Obviously, it needs to go to consultation. It needs then to be accompanied by a budget and affordability. And the programme for government takes precedent actually of the budget. So if that's agreed, those are the budget priorities. And then it requires a legislative programme. Much work has been done in terms of legislative bills and preparedness. So there is a body of bills for an incoming ministers to decide, and indeed an executive to be brought forward. So I think there is an opportunity to move with pace, particularly for a 1 year, but that's not for me to decide, but we stand ready to work on all that groundwork that was being done. It'll be for your parties to say whether there is informed through that process or not. I think there seems to be a coalescence around some core themes for a programme for government that looks towards the green growth aspect, and obviously what we've seen in Knocknay, and childcare and those provisions, as well as transformation of special education needs and health services and waiting list.
Okay, thank you now.
I just have a small question that hasn't come up yet, and I just want to see if you can give us an update on the civil service pay and the settlement around that. If you just give us a wee update in terms of going forward.
Yes, of course that's not a matter for myself to be directly involved in, but I would say that engagement with our colleagues in the unions has been very constructive over the past couple of years as we've worked with them. Within the 685 million that was identified, there was an element within there for public sector pay, and the Department of Finance Minister will be leading those engagements, and I think they have had discussions with the unions as well as in terms of moving that forward, but that will be for them to lead on as part of the processing. But I would just like to give, I guess, working when we, in the absence of an executive, I felt it important to engage with all those kind of sectors, the community and voluntary sector with our ALBs, but also with our union colleagues. And obviously it's positive that we've got some clarity in the budget envelope, but that will be for ministers to enter those negotiations and delivering those.
Okay. Well, I think we went a wee bit over there, but I think it was worth it. But I think with 2 years of pent up questions in some regards. But thank you so much for that today, and I think we covered a lot of ground. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay, members. So we're going to move on to our next briefing, and apologies that the member Stephen Orme has been sitting there waiting. Apologies to you as well that we're getting here a wee bit later. So members, you'll be aware we're going to take a briefing on the raise function within the Assembly. So Okay, so Stephen Orme is an Assembly researcher here in Parliament Buildings. So members, I would refer you to page 54 of the Clerk's brief and page 56 of the RAISE service guide that are found in your pack. So I think you have some slides, have you? No?
Yes, yeah, I'm ready to go there. And
Okay, good job. Okay, thank you.
No problem about the delay. That was interesting for me too. So
Okay, that's good stuff.
I'm getting paid regardless. So I'm
Good stuff.
so yes, I'm Stephen. I am a researcher within a research service. Most of my work is will probably be with yourselves, and with the Committee for Communities as well. I'm conscious that there are a couple of new MLAs with us. And some of you have been here before. I've literally done papers for some of you before, and you'll have been on committees and received presentations. But hopefully this is a good refresher for you anyway. It should be maybe less than 20 minutes, hopefully a good bit less than 20 minutes. And I'll just cover kind of what is the research service, the work of the library, so a couple of doors down, the work of ourselves as research officers, and then how to place a request with us and how to make use of our services. So RAISE is the Research and Information Service. In Scotland, it's the Scottish Parliament Information Centre, so it's SPICE, and other places aren't as imaginative. It employs subject specialists and professional librarians to provide research and information to yourselves, and that's to MLAs, committees, and so they're listed there. So basically yourselves and your bodies, so committees, the Assembly Commission, and sometimes senior Assembly staff as well. Will provide information too. In terms of the library, I'm on the outside of the library. I use the library in much the same way you would, and it's a really great resource. You get access to books and academic journals and periodicals. They've got a very broad range of the kind of stuff you would need day to day or week to week. But if they don't have it as standard, and without putting too much on them, they are fantastically helpful just on a customer basis. And some of you will know that, and I certainly know that. They're great with us as well. They provide, as well as that, Northern Ireland legislation and UK legislation and publications, a lot of statistics and things like that. Literally a quiet place to read, which is valuable for me, and probably for yourselves. It's somewhere you don't have to take a phone call or can't take a phone call, so it can be handy. They're open 9 to 5, Monday to Thursday. They're closed on a Friday, being a surgery day. They used to be open until 30 minutes after the Assembly rose on every sitting day, but at the end of a year or at the end of a mandate, that led to some people being in there till 3 or 4 in the morning sometimes. So for their sake, that is now, they're open till 8 on plenary days or until half an hour after the Assembly rises, so whatever's earlier of those two. Some of you might be familiar with information packs. Again, very useful resource for me, but basically any time, not necessarily legislation or anything like that, but when there's a motion, so like the very initial kind of stage of your engagement with a given policy area, one of the librarians will pull together an information pack, and it's basically anything that the government has done or the Assembly or other legislatures or other countries that might be relevant to, and then, as well as that, like charities and policy groups and lobbyists and things like that, and news coverage as well. Anything that's relevant, they will basically dump into the pack, and it's a good kind of read around. It's available on our intranet that you have access to, and in the library itself will normally be sitting up in stands as well, handily for you. The link's normally emailed 2 Fridays before the debate where that's possible. Sometimes it's not, and sometimes it'll be closer, but they should always be available as quickly as they can have them. They're not published because there's a lot of, like, say, Belfast Telegraph or Irish News or whatever reproduced there, so it's not a matter of publishing or reproducing. And as I say, certainly for yourselves, but also for me, if I'm working on a given topic, that'll be one of my first kind of ports of call, because it's a useful initial kind of trawl of what's happening in a given area at any point in time. Deposited papers, I was looking through some of the questions you had lodged this morning just to kind of see, because this is kind of useful. You have asked a lot of questions, so fair play to you. But deposited papers, you'll see sometimes you'll ask a question and it's like a 2-paragraph answer. It's quite simple and you can just get it, like it's lodged on the website. Deposited papers would be more, I'll just knock them out, more where it takes like a PDF of 2 or 3 pages. So for instance, I think a few people have asked like the number of people on social housing waiting lists within the given constituency, or the expected supply of social housing over the next few years in a given constituency. That won't be published as standard in statistics, but a department will be able to pull that together and will deposit it in the library, so they're available on the Assembly website. And again, kind of useful for me in practice, but there may already be an answer there sometimes for questions you're asking. So the research service then, I'll come back to the maps, but basically we do a lot of things that look very similar to it, but they're worth kind of flagging the differences. So I printed this one because I worked on it, and it was something that I know the chair was interested in a different context in the previous mandate. So this is a bill paper, and it's on the Abortion Services Safe Access Zones Bill that was passed, and there was some kind of legal challenges and stuff since. But a bill paper is one thing we do, so resources permitting, glancing at the clerk, a former researcher here, because sometimes we're a bit overwhelmed, but if we have enough research hours to do it, for every bill that's introduced, we'll produce a paper. And it's basically like any other paper we produce that discuss kind of the current state of the law, policy arguments in other places and other examples. But it will also have basically a clause by clause explanation of what the bill will do. So if you ever use like an explanatory memorandum of an act, that's law in force. This is just that, but for a bill. There's no substitute for understanding the legislation itself as it's drafted, but that should hopefully be of some use. Research paper then, and I'm glad I printed this one, but this is outcomes-based accountability in the programme for government. So that was about the first proper research paper I did when I started. And it kind of touches on a couple of things he's mentioned in terms of the various iterations of the programme for government since 2016 and outcomes-based accountability. A research paper will dig into something in real depth, so that would particularly looks at the programme for government here, but it also digs into outcomes-based accountability, or OBA, as a concept, and the strengths or weaknesses of that in general or in a Northern Irish context, and then how yourselves can kind of possibly sit within that in terms of using it to scrutinise effectively and things like that. Briefing papers and briefing notes. So last two things will hold up, hopefully. Briefing paper would be more like something like this. So the executive's international relations and comparisons with Scotland and Wales. So that was the very first paper I did. A briefing paper is distinct from a research paper in the sense that it's substantial enough, but it just tells you what is going on. And at a certain point in time, there's no real. I wasn't doing international relations analysis there, mainly because I can't. But so that looked at where we have our bureaus and where Scotland and Wales have their bureaus, how they link in with Invest NI and the comparative bodies and things like that. And then the last thing is a briefing note. So again, about the programme for government. So this tied in with the research paper. So about 6 or 7 weeks after I did that research paper, I did a briefing note on the programme for government draft outcomes framework. These are basically just short pieces of information that just tell you the situation as quickly as we can. And that actually is a table that shows the changes of the outcomes since 2016 through the outcomes delivery plan by the Civil Service during the last break in the Assembly and Executive, and then into the draft outcomes framework in 2021. So all of our other papers would have like key points, like 1 or 2 pages at the top that you can read if you don't want to read the rest of it. But those wouldn't, because they're so short to begin with. So that's kind of the idea there. Oral presentations and briefings then is number 4 there. And basically anything we produce we'll speak to. I know I've produced papers for other members, and it's just sometimes a case of calling down to the office if it's for an individual MLA and running through it. And sometimes it's a case of a committee presentation or something like this. But as I say, anything we produce, it'll be submitted to you, and we're happy to speak to it. Then in terms of other research products, we would have a blog called Research Matters, assemblyresearchmatters.org, I think. Our statisticians would produce constituency profiles, and then more so other researchers on more substantive kind of committees or portfolios. So Executive Office Committee is very important, but it has the centre of government role, whereas say health and justice and education and more like specific topics would lend themselves to infographics and dashboards and things like that more. Most of the work when we're up and running is to committees, but as I say, occasionally we'll provide stuff to individual MLAs as well. Any MLA can submit a request. It's your property once we produce it, so outside of a committee context, it's yours to do with what you please. Occasionally we'll ask if we can publish it afterwards if it turns out that 3 or 4 people are asking for the same thing. but by default it's not put anywhere beyond the MLA that's asked for it. So again, resources permitting, we will do proactive research as well. And we kind of have a balance here because we don't want to be and we can't be setting the agenda, but at the same time, if something pops up, so this is an example from 2017, where the Scottish and Welsh governments were finding issues in terms of the financial sustainability of free bus passes and free transport for older people. And that kind of provoked that blog post of just looking at the finances here. I'm not saying it is or it isn't, but just flagging it as an issue that MLAs may be interested in. And there are some infographics that communicate it as well as just plain text. So we have a researcher that's almost entirely dedicated to GIS, or Geographical Information Systems, or maps. A lot of you will be familiar with, particularly in the neighbourhood renewal context, or TBUC or urban villages, the multiple deprivation measures. So red to blue is kind of most to least deprived. It's a comparative data set, and you'll see yourselves there parts of Belfast and Derry, Londonderry, and then west of the Ban would be some of the more deprived areas and border areas as well. And then parts of South Belfast and North Down would just immediately kind of jump out as some of the least deprived. And then another map there is travel time to the nearest emergency hospital. And again, not an immediate matter for the Executive Office Committee, but within the programme for government and things like that. You'll see spots again west of the Ban, Ballykindler, close to where I'm from, and then the Antrim coast would be the worst in terms of travel time to the nearest A&E. So again, just another way of communicating useful information, hopefully. Just a handful more examples of infographics there. So on the top left or middle left, that's from a blog post, I believe, on children's health and children's physical activity. The bottom left is, it should be labelled better, but that is basically the primary international locations of Northern Ireland's international trade. And to be honest, if anything, that would be better if it was kind of cropped and made a lot bigger. But you'll see there the Republic, and then the Republic of Ireland, the United States and Canada, and then a couple of European countries are our primary export regions, and that's excluding the UK, obviously. And then finally this on the right is from our Public Finance Scrutiny Unit. So that's a dedicated unit that looks at basically the budget and Department of Finance and things like that. And it shows kind of the big changes from year to year in terms of public spending and how finance is being allocated. And again, it's just a better way of communicating sometimes than just the written word. Most of my stuff is reading and writing just because of the nature of the brief, which is fine by me, but in terms of your role just as MLAs beyond this committee, it's useful to have. So one thing that I know MLAs tend to find useful is a constituency profile. So again, these are on our website, or on our pages within the Assembly website. And they cover basically the demographics of each constituency, as well as some of the key indicators there, so health, education, income, crime and stuff. They take a bit of work because a lot of stuff isn't naturally accessible on a constituency basis to begin with, but they're up and running now, and they're often handy for you. And then finally, in terms of kind of beyond the standard stuff, we produce dashboards. So on the left there, so these are both COVID-19. On the left, that is hospital admissions across the UK, including Northern Ireland, and it's kind of broken down by nation, between roughly January 2020 and January 22. So you can kind of see the spikes in the winter there, and a couple of other spikes that turned up during the pandemic. And then on the right, you're seeing the amount of additional COVID-19 funding, first by department and then by the nature of support. So again, just another channel to push stuff out. The last thing I'll mention then is our Knowledge Exchange seminar series. So also known as basically within our offices as KES seminars. And the formal way of saying it is a forum that encourages debate on a wide range of research findings, and the aim is evidence-based policy and lawmaking here. Basically, my role and my senior research officer in managing us, we do desk-based research, but we can't express any kind of opinion or analysis really. This partnership gets Queen's and Ulster University and Open University involved, and we can basically task academics to produce, instead of a 30-page academic paper, which are tiring for me to read, let alone yourselves, to produce basically a 2 or 3 page briefing and speak to it in the long gallery normally or something like that. And it's a good way of expanding the work that the research service does to kind of external independent voices, but that are still evidence based and are able to at least offer an opinion that you could agree with or bounce off. Beyond KES, we would regularly have PhD students in from UKRI, UK Research and Innovation, so they'll get scholarships, and as a condition of that, they will have to work with us, say, for 3 months or something like that. And again, that's good for them and it's good for us in terms of that fresh perspective. So in terms of what we don't provide, just in terms of the things that regularly come up, we don't write speeches for MLAs. I know occasionally the committee staff might write something for the committee chair in your role as committee chair, in terms of reflecting the committee inquiry or deliberations on bill or something like that. We wouldn't be providing that. We don't write specific questions for committees. You may see this in a couple of weeks if I'm back, but sometimes we'll flag issues that you may wish to consider, but it's always kind of couched in that language because, as with kind of the rest of these as well, you're the ones with the mandate. I have never gotten a few thousand people to vote for me, and I never will, so it's your judgment to make. We don't indicate any opinion or political association. As I say, in the context of an MLA request, we wouldn't provide details of the research customer to any other party. So if I have to ask a department about information in relation to an MLA's request, I'll just say it's a customer, and if the PISH will say it's an MLA, if you're on an all-party group and they happen to know you're interested in it, they can probably figure it out, but it won't be on our account. And we also never make policy proposals. So again, that's just a case of we'll lay out options and what other places do and things like that. But again, it's yourselves with the mandate, and it's for yourselves and for the executive as well to take that forward. So in terms of placing a request, just very quickly then, in terms of getting a request from the library, just go to their inquiry desk right at the front. Their customer service is great. You can email them there and then via the committee clerks as well if you want. In terms of with us, I know some of you have used this before. We have an inquiry form on the page on our website that is relatively easy to find. Again, you can go to the library inquiry desk and they'll pass it on, or if it's through committee business, the committee clerks or staff can pass it on to us. And we'll basically get back in touch as quickly as we can to kind of confirm the details of your request. Sometimes we'll flesh that out a bit because we happen to know a wee bit more about what other stuff that might be useful, and then a time scale for when we'll get back to you. So I'm happy to take any questions. I won't take any offence if there aren't any, because I know that was a heavy session, but happy to take any questions, yeah.
Thank you. Just one for me very quickly. So in terms of going to the library, I went there during the week there, and as you say, they're very, very helpful. But could our own research staff go in and ask, because at the minute it's quite a lot on, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
can they also make the request?
Yes, they can. I mean, so yes, with the library they can, and also, I maybe didn't lay that out fully enough, a lot of the time with MLA requests, it'll be from, say, a policy and research officer, yes. And sometimes it'll be not even a policy officer linked to an individual MLA, it'll be like a party head of policy, okay. And they just stick it in under an MLA's name. And in practice, the paper will be for that MLA, but as I say, if an individual MLA just then hands it to the head of policy, that's for them, that's for yourselves, that's fine by us, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So Brian, and then I have Harry. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Stephen. That was new to me, so useful information. So the most I've done, apart from reading the papers in the library, is sometimes I see papers sitting on the shelves, and I'll say, can I take a copy of this? And told yes, and pick up some useful briefing papers, whatever. So my question is, how do you know what is available? Is it all listed on the website in the Assembly?
Yeah.
Because that's my question.
Yeah, no, you've hit on the single biggest thing I didn't mention. Yeah. Right. So yes, on the Assembly website there is a Research and Information Service page, and basically you can go through by year and see what's available. It could be done by theme, or it could be done that way. The way it is published at the minute, which is kind of beyond my sole control, is just in order of publication. So again, I'm going back to the way I would trawl through previous stuff we've done when I'm doing research, but I would just go to, say, the last 5 years in the first instance, and you just do Control F and type in health or whatever, and then you'll find everything that's there. In terms of keeping up to date more generally, I would say the blog would be a good place to go. In terms of the blog posts are intended to be if you're being rigorously objective and impartial and very careful not to say, convey an opinion, the blog post is as conversational as we get, and there's no footnotes, everyone's kind of hyperlinked, and you can read it. There's supposed to be 300 words a minute and no more than 3 minutes, so they're supposed to be quite brief. So that'd be the way to keep up to date. But in terms of where the work is, it's on the raise pages in the Assembly website, basically. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, can we move on then, Connie? Go ahead, Carrie.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. No, just to say, Stephen, excellent, just to be comment, excellent service. We shouldn't single anybody out, but Christine was always very helpful, really great. I mean, even history of the place, anything at all. If she didn't know about it, she found out about it for you. So, an excellent service. And just to say, we really appreciate it. Not useful troll things, really good too, just to give you an insight into before you do anything. So, no, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Connie.
No, thanks, Stephen, for coming in today. And I think as well, just to reiterate that I've been in contact with Christine before and she's been very, very helpful. And as an MLA, and previously when I worked as a research and policy officer for another MLA, it's a really good service. And one thing I'm interested in is the CAS seminars, and if they're coming back. They haven't been on in a while.
Yeah, no, they are. I don't want to speak too much above my station, but I know that, again, it kind of comes back to that not wanting to set the agenda type of thing. So in the absence of an executive, and then feeling that in the absence of an elected Assembly Speaker, so obviously Alex Maskey remained the Speaker in the absence of a Speaker elected in this mandate. But basically in the absence of any sort of indication of executive priorities or party priorities, the research service didn't want to go ahead with KES for fear of setting the agenda in some way, but they will be coming back. Yes, definitely. Yeah. I'd say things like childcare or something would be one of the first issues or something like that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good job. Thank you very much. I think that's everyone. But again, thanks very much, Stephen, and thanks for the presentation. We'll be able to go through it in slower time tonight, so thank you. Okay, so members, we're going to move on. We've got a statutory rule, statutory rule 2023/197, the Fair Employment Specification of Public Authorities Amendment Order, Northern Ireland 2023. And members, I refer you to page 68 for the Examiner of Statutory Rules presentation, page 82 for the SR cover note, and page 84 for the SL5 letter to Business Office, page 85 for SL 2023/197, the Fair Employment Specification of Public Order Amendment Public Authorities Amendment Order, Northern Ireland 2023. Page 92 has the explanatory memorandum, and page 3 of the table papers you'll find the first report for the Examiner of Statutory Rules of 16th of February 2024. So members, you're advised that this SR updates the list of bodies which should be deemed public authorities, and as such it is considered as legal housekeeping to keep the legislation technically up to date. There was no previous committee consideration for this rule, and as per the first report of the Examiner of Statutory Rules of 16th of February 2024, the Examiner of Statutory Rules has no issues to raise. So I would advise you therefore that the statutory rule is subject to negative resolution, and to remind you that we received that briefing last week around this, and we were advised that it is stated that SRs subject to negative resolution are laid as law but can be annulled by the Assembly, and the time period for annulment for this SR expires on the 4th of March. Have any members got any questions in this regard? No.
Long list there. There's a long list.
Oh yeah. So it's all in the committee pack. So I will formally ask then that the Committee for the Executive Office has considered SR 2023/197, the Fair Employment Specification of Public Authorities Amendment Order, Northern Ireland 2023, and has no objections to the rule. Agreed? Okay, members, moving on then. So the draft forward work programme is found at page 97 of your pack, and following an introductory briefing from the First Minister and Deputy First Minister, the committee would expect an introductory briefing from the junior ministers. So I think we've got FM and DFM, is that
next week? Yes.
Next week, so that'll be quite an interesting one, and then we'll hopefully get the junior ministers in shortly after that. So are you content to proceed with this work programme? Okay, so moving on then, correspondence. I refer members to page 101 of the pack and page 69 of the table papers for a summary of committee correspondence. And I would refer you to page 102 for a letter from the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State, Home Office, to the Chair of the Protocol on Ireland/Northern Ireland Subcommittee on the Illegal Migration Act, and advise members that the committee is copied into ongoing correspondence just for information purposes. So members, I would suggest that we invite the dedicated mechanism to brief the committee on developments regarding Article 2 of the Windsor Framework since the last mandate, and if we're agreed at, okay? Yeah. So on page 105 there's a letter from the Human Rights Consortium seeking permission to be added to the consultation list going forward, agreed? And on page 106 there's a letter from the Children's Law Centre requesting permission for a copy of the departmental first day brief. Okay, agreed with that. Agreed. So page 107 there's a press release and a report at page 109 from the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council on the UK Government's financial support package for the restored executive, and you may wish to see the charts and tables related to this item too if you want any more information to contact committee staff. So members, on page 135 there's a letter from the Victims and Survivors Service seeking permission to brief the committee on their work, and I think that's, are we happy to go ahead and invite? And I would suggest that as part of that same committee meeting we would also then invite the Commissioner for Survivors of Institutional Abuse to brief the committee on her role and to provide an update on the developments since the last mandate. Okay, agreed. Page 137 there's a press release from the Department of Finance regarding the public sector pay, and would advise that the additional resource DEL allocation to the Executive Office was 3.4 million, and that was what I raised with one of our with Gareth earlier in relation to what would like an update on what that's to be spent on. And we will invite officials in due course to brief the committee on the department's spending plans for the next financial year. Lastly, in terms of papers then, on page 70 of the papers pack there's an invitation to the Deputy Chair from Playboard NI for the launch of Adapt My Play, an inclusive resource centre on Monday the 4th of March at 11 a.m. in the Long Gallery. And I have to say I forgot to forward my letter to the to the clerk, so we both received an invite to that, and I would imagine that all MLAs will be invited to that event. So you're asked to note that. Refer members to page 72 of the table papers for a memo from the Clerk of the Windsor Framework Democratic Scrutiny Committee and a letter from the Windsor Framework Democratic Scrutiny Committee, the First Minister, Deputy First Minister, on the functions of the Democratic Scrutiny Committee. I ask you to note that. Page 83, a letter and first day brief from the Bernardo's NI seeking permission to be added to the consultation list going forward. Agreed. Yeah. And there on page 86 of the table papers there's a letter of introduction from Pivotal, an independent public sector think tank, and you're asked to note that. So under any other business then, 3 TU officials are to appear before the Democratic Scrutiny Committee tomorrow. They are Tom Reid, Deputy Secretary, Intergovernmental and International Relations of the Executive Office, Mr Aidan Connolly, Director of the Office of the Northern Ireland Executive in Brussels of the Executive Office, and Mr Anthony Miller, Director of Post-EU Exit Coordination Group, also in the Executive Office, and the formal communication from this will be in next week's pack. Have members got any other business of their own they'd like to raise? No. Okay, so then you're asked.
Sure,
sorry, go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
Just regarding next week,
yes.
That I won't be here next week. So I'm just thinking back to the photograph issue.
Oh yes.
Oh God.
Bingo card.
We will get that. I think that the gentleman who was to take the photo, I think he's in the building. So when we have a full committee, we will definitely
sometime in March we'll get it.
Thank you, but thanks for raising that early on. Members, just in closing then, so next week's meeting, same time in this room, Wednesday the 20th of February. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Committee Room 30, sound. Committee Room 30, sound. Committee Room 30, sound. Committee Room 30, sound. Committee Room 30, sound.